If we don't sleep in the same bed, we will freeze tonight. Don't resist, said the Apache woman. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Snow pressed down across the northern Wyoming frontier in a heavy, unmoving blanket, turning the ridgeline into a long stretch of pale white where nothing seemed alive except the wind cutting through the pines in short, uneven bursts. Mason Hale stepped out from the side of the old trapper's cabin with an armful of firewood balanced against his chest, his breath rising in thick, steady clouds as the cold hit the raw skin around his jawline. He walked carefully, not because he feared slipping, but because years of working cattle had trained him to conserve energy in cold weather. The muscles in his left shoulder pulled with a dull ache, a reminder of a ranch fight from 6 years earlier that ended with him leaving behind the only people he had cared about. Since then, he lived alone and kept to a strict routine: cut wood, repair the cabin, hunt when needed, stay out of sight, because quiet made it easier to control the memories he tried not to revisit. He set the firewood down and turned toward the tree lean, planning to check his snare line before the storm thickened. As he stepped forward, he noticed something off: fresh, narrow footprints cutting across the snow in a pattern that didn't match any of his usual markers. They were small, light, and hurried. The spacing between steps was uneven, as if the person had been moving fast while losing strength. Mason crouched down, studying the prints with the same calm focus he used to judge cattle trails, and a knot of tension tightened in his stomach. He didn't want unexpected visitors. Anyone out here either needed help or meant trouble. He followed the trail at a steady pace, each boot sinking half a foot into the cold crust. The wind picked up, pushing loose flakes sideways and stinging his face. The deeper he walked, the more the tracks showed signs of distress. The heel marks dragged. Toe prints dug in sharply. Someone had stumbled, corrected, stumbled again. He adjusted his pace, faster now, a part of him worried that whoever made those tracks might not still be standing. As he reached the slope leading down to the ravine, he stopped. A thick pine branch had fallen under the weight of the snow, cracking halfway down its trunk and pointing diagonally toward the ground. Beneath it, half covered in drift, lay the still form of a young woman. He moved down the slope immediately, not running, but moving fast in a controlled way that wouldn't risk falling. When he reached her, he knelt and brushed the snow away from her shoulders with gloved hands. Her dark hair was tangled against her cheek, partly frozen, and her breathing came in shallow pulls that spaced out alarmingly long. Her eyes stayed closed, lashes crusted with frost. The worn deerskin dress she wore was torn across the bodice and shoulder, exposing the upper curve of her chest where the cold had reddened the skin. The rip looked like it had been caused by force, not by accident. Mason set his palm lightly against her cheek. Her skin felt like ice. His throat tightened slightly, not in panic, but in the immediate calculation of time. She didn't have much of it. He checked quickly for injuries, lifting the broken branch off her with deliberate strength, sliding it aside so it wouldn't trap her again. When he placed his arm beneath her back, he felt the tremor running through her body, a faint, uncontrollable shaking that told him she had been lying there far too long. Her fingers twitched weakly against his coat, a reflex driven by the part of her still fighting to stay conscious. "Can you hear me?" he asked, voice low and steady. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. He didn't waste another second. He wrapped his coat tighter around her torso, securing the torn dress as best he could, then lifted her carefully into his arms. Her weight was light, almost alarmingly so, and the cold had stiffened her muscles into a half-curled position that made carrying her awkward but manageable. Mason pushed back up the slope, adjusting his stance so he wouldn't slip. The wind hit them harder at the top, and he felt her shallow breaths against his collarbone, each one shorter than the last. Inside the cabin, heat from a morning's small fire had already faded, leaving the interior dim and frigid. He kicked the door shut and set her gently on the bed, pulling the thickest wool blanket over her immediately. She winced at the contact with the warmer fabric, a sign of how deep the cold had reached. Mason moved quickly. He stacked fresh wood in the stove, struck a match, and coaxed the flame into life until the fire climbed high. The sudden glow cast sharp silhouettes across the walls, showing the rough repairs he had made over the years. Patched boards, reinforced beams, everything built to withstand storms exactly like this one. He turned toward the bed. The blanket had slipped slightly, revealing the torn bodice again. He grabbed another blanket and tucked it around her upper body, careful not to touch the exposed skin more than necessary. She stirred then, eyelids opening just enough to reveal dark, alert eyes that tracked his movement with a mix of fear and disorientation. Her voice came out cracked and small. "Where am I?" "Safe for now," Mason said, easing onto the stool beside the bed. "Storm's closing in. Found you under a tree." She blinked slowly, trying to make sense of where she was. Her breathing steadied but remained thin. After a moment, she whispered, "My name is Taya." He nodded once. "Mason." Taya's gaze drifted to the stove, then to the window where snow battered the frame. She swallowed with difficulty, the motion slow and painful. "Men were chasing me," she murmured, voice rough. "They burned our camp. My people scattered. I ran." The strain it took for her to speak made Mason hold up a hand. "Don't push it. You're half frozen." She tried to lift her arm, but couldn't. Her fingers trembled in a curled position near her chest. The blanket shifted again, and she didn't have the strength to pull it back up. Mason did it for her, adjusting it slowly until her shoulders and neckline were fully covered. Taya watched him with a sharp, searching look, checking whether he meant her harm, whether he wanted something, whether she had just traded one danger for another. Mason didn't look away, letting her judge him as long as she needed. He finally spoke in a calm, even tone. "You'll warm up. Keep drinking when I bring water. You're safe here until the storm passes." Her eyes softened just slightly, though exhaustion pulled her lids down again. She whispered, "I didn't think anyone would find me." "You weren't invisible," he answered. "Your tracks gave you away." Her breathing slowed then, not from weakness, but from the first flicker of relief she had allowed herself in days. Mason sat back, elbows on his knees, watching her closely to make sure she didn't drift into dangerous sleep. He didn't trust chance. He trusted observation. She was young, injured, and running from something he didn't fully understand yet. But helping her was the only choice that made sense to him. The fire grew hotter. The room warmed. Taya's shivering eased piece by piece. Outside, the storm built into a thick, heavy roar, and the walls of the cabin groaned under the pressure. Mason stayed seated, eyes steady, mind already working through what tomorrow might bring. He had lived these mountains alone for years. Tonight, that changed. The fire had grown strong enough to push a steady band of warmth across the room, yet the storm outside kept tightening its grip on the cabin, shaking the wooden frame in short, uneven jolts that made Taya's eyes flick open again. Mason saw her flinch at each loud gust, the sound reminding her of something she hadn't explained yet, something she had avoided in the panic of being found half frozen. Her breathing came quicker than before, not from the cold, but from a memory she was trying to keep buried. Mason watched her reaction and understood there was more behind her fear than the ruined camp she had mentioned. He poured melted snow water into a tin cup and carried it to her. When he lifted her head slightly to help her drink, she didn't resist, but she studied him with a sharp focus, as if she expected him to ask questions she still didn't want to answer. He didn't. Instead, he kept his voice low, sipped slowly. Taya took a small swallow, wincing at the warmth hitting her dry throat. Her voice scraped out in a rough whisper. "How far from the ridge?" "Half a mile," Mason answered. "You almost made it over the rise. The wind would have taken you if I hadn't walked that line for wood." Her eyes lowered at that, not ashamed, but overwhelmed by how close she had come to being buried under the storm. She set the cup aside, her hand trembling in a delayed reaction to everything she had survived. Mason noticed the tremor and placed the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but he didn't comment. She seemed grateful for the lack of pressure. The cabin creaked again, a deep groan that made Taya tense. Mason leaned in slightly. "No one's coming through this storm. Not tonight." Her gaze flicked to him, and he saw a question in her expression, why he lived out here, why he kept to a cabin 2 days' ride from the nearest town, why a man who clearly knew how to handle himself had chosen a life in the middle of nowhere. Listeners would wonder the same thing, and she finally voiced it in a careful breath. Why are you alone here? This place is too far from people. Mason rubbed a hand over his jaw, hesitating only because the answer pushed against the part of himself he kept locked down. I worked a ranch farther south, he said slowly. Fight broke out. Bad one. Wrong men made worse choices, and I was there for the end of it. He looked toward the fire as he continued, his voice even but heavy. Buried someone who didn't deserve it. I left before I buried more. Taya listened without interrupting. She absorbed the tone, the weight behind it, and didn't question further. Her instincts told her he didn't speak of this often. Silence settled for several seconds, not tense but filled with the slow understanding of two strangers beginning to piece each other together. Mason stood and checked the cabin door, pressing against the frame to make sure the snow piled outside hadn't warped it. When he returned to the bed, Taya finally asked the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest. Did you see any other tracks besides mine? Her voice tightened at the end. No, Mason said, sitting on the stool again. But the wind could have covered things fast. She swallowed hard, her expression shifting from simple fear to something closer to calculation. She looked younger in that moment, not in age, but in vulnerability. She pulled the blanket closer to her collarbone. I wasn't the only one who ran. Some of my people headed toward the western trees. I don't know who made it. Mason noticed what she didn't say. She hadn't mentioned a family member, a partner, a sibling. There was no we, no one she called by name. Whoever she had lost, she carried it quietly. He leaned forward, forearms resting on his thighs. Why'd they come after your camp? Taya's lips pressed together for a long moment before she spoke. A group of men came 2 nights ago. Not soldiers, hunters, traders, drunk with their own power. Her voice wavered, not with tears, but with anger held tightly in her chest. They wanted supplies, horses, anything they could take. When my people refused, they set fire to the tents. She paused, shoulders tightening under the blankets. I saw them take 2 women. They tried to take me, but I got away. I didn't run fast enough. Mason let out a slow breath through his nose. He didn't say the obvious, that she might be the only survivor from her part of the ridge. He could see she already knew that. A sharp gust rattled the shutters, making her jump slightly. Mason reached out without thinking and placed a hand on the edge of the blanket near her arm, not touching her skin but anchoring her. Nobody's finding this place in this weather, he said. They'd freeze before they got halfway. Taya nodded, but her breathing stayed uneven. She stared at the ceiling beams for a few seconds, then whispered, I didn't know if I'd wake up again. Her voice held a raw honesty that she hadn't allowed herself earlier. You did, Mason said quietly. Her eyes drifted to him with a look that carried something new, gratitude mixed with confusion over why a stranger would risk himself for her. She studied the lines of his face, the faint scar near his jaw, the way he kept one foot angled as if his legs still bothered him. She could tell he wasn't a man who invited company. That he had carried her here meant something she couldn't define yet. Snow slammed against the roof in a heavy burst that shook dust loose from the rafters. Mason stood immediately and added another log to the stove. Taya watched him move, steady, controlled, deliberate. And for the first time since waking up, she felt the edges of fear pull back slightly. Then her stomach tightened with a quiet realization. Do you have food for 2? She asked. It wasn't a simple question. It carried worry. She didn't want to be a burden. Mason didn't hesitate. Enough for days, he replied. Storm might keep us inside, but we'll manage. The word resettled in her differently than she expected. She blinked, feeling something unfamiliar. Safety, maybe, or simply the relief of not being alone against the cold. She shifted slightly under the blankets, and a small, involuntary grunt of pain escaped her. Mason noticed immediately. Where else are you hurt? She hesitated, then used her good hand to pull the blanket down just enough to reveal a long bruise stretching across her ribs. The torn bodice made the area more exposed than she wanted, and she pulled the blanket up quickly again, embarrassed. Mason didn't stare. He kept his gaze on her eyes. Looks like you took a bad fall. Probably when that branch came down. It was dark, she whispered. I only saw shadows behind me. He nodded, processing the details, already building a mental list of what she would need. Rest, warmth, steady food, binding for the ribs if they worsened. She looked at him again, studying the stern line of his shoulders, the quiet seriousness of his expression. Why did you follow the tracks? She asked. You could have ignored them. Mason's answer came without hesitation. Didn't sit right leaving someone out there. Taya let out a slow breath and closed her eyes briefly, letting that truth settle into her bones. The fire cracked loudly beside them, and the warmth reached farther across the room, finally climbing into the corners where the cold had settled most stubbornly. Mason stood and checked the windows again, running his hand across each frame for drafts. Taya watched him without speaking, but a small part of her chest loosened each time he made sure the storm couldn't get in. When he returned to the stool, she shifted on her side, her voice soft but steadier now. Mason, thank you. He didn't reply with words. He simply gave a small nod, the kind that meant he had made his choice long before she woke. Outside, the wind screamed across the ridge. Inside, the heat grew stronger, the danger eased slightly, and the fragile beginnings of a bond began forming in the quiet space between them. And both of them understood, whether they said it out loud or not, that the storm was only the first challenge they would face together. The storm deepened through the night, pushing new weight onto the cabin roof with slow, heavy thuds that made the wooden beams creak in uneven intervals. Mason woke before dawn, pulled from sleep by the cold brushing along his cheek where the fire had burned low. He rose immediately, added fresh logs, and coaxed the flames back into a strong, steady burn. When he turned toward the bed, he saw Taya lying curled beneath the blanket, her face partly hidden by her hair, her breathing shallow but more regular than the day before. She stirred at the noise of the crackling fire, her eyelids lifting with cautious slowness. The stiffness in her movements made him step closer. How's your chest? He asked. His voice held a grounded concern, not a softness, but enough to show he was paying attention. She took a small, controlled breath and winced. Hurts when I turn, she admitted. Likely bruised ribs, he said. Maybe cracked. I'll bind them once the room warms. She nodded and shifted on her back, revealing the careful way she held herself so her injured side didn't drag. The blanket slipped slightly, and she caught it with her good hand before it exposed the torn bodice again. Her cheeks warmed with slight embarrassment. Mason pretended not to notice, moving instead to fetch a strip of cloth he had torn from an old shirt long before meeting her. Listeners would have wondered if he owned anything clean enough to use for an injury, and the answer came now. He returned to her side with the fabric, and she hesitated before lifting her arm just enough to allow him access. Her eyes stayed on his face as if waiting for any sign that he would take advantage. She saw nothing but concentration. Mason wrapped the cloth around her ribs, tightening it slowly until she inhaled a little easier. The tension in her shoulders loosened by a fraction. You're steady-handed, she said, surprised by how gentle he was. Had to learn, Mason replied. A man alone fixes all his own injuries. That answer raised another question she hadn't asked earlier: how long he had been truly alone. She studied the rough stitching on his coat, the patched edges of the cabin walls, the organized stack of supplies arranged with no help but his own hands. How many winters have you stayed here? She asked. 4, he said without lifting his eyes from the cloth. Enough to know when a storm means trouble. And this one, she pressed lightly. Bad one, he admitted. Snow's going to bury the door if it keeps up. She swallowed, her gaze drifting to the window where white drifts climbed higher than the sill. Can you get out if something happens? I can dig through when it settles, he answered. Not moving now. Too deep. That explanation filled a gap listeners would have questioned: why he didn't attempt to ride out for help. It was impossible. They were trapped until the sky cleared. Once the bandage was secured, Mason stepped to the stove and filled a tin with warm broth. When he returned, Taya pushed herself upright using slow, careful movements, determined not to look weak even as her arm trembled from the effort. He handed her the tin and waited silently while she drank. The steam drifting off the liquid softened her expression as the warmth moved through her body. She set the tin down with a shaky exhale. "I don't know why I made it this far," she said quietly. "I ran without looking back. I didn't think." "You thought enough to move toward higher ground," Mason said. "You weren't running blind." Taya's eyes lifted to his. "How did you know I was coming from the ridge?" "The prince angled toward the rise," he answered, and the snow pattern changed near the creek. Someone had passed through fast. A pause settled between them, not tense, simply thoughtful. Taya shifted again, adjusting the blanket to keep the cold from reaching her exposed shoulder. "You said earlier you saw no other tracks," she murmured. "That's right." Her jaw tightened, her expression darkening with the weight of the truth she didn't want to accept. The storm had erased any chance of finding the others. Mason watched her closely, seeing the grief she had tried to keep hidden behind anger and survival instinct. She asked suddenly, "How far is the nearest settlement?" "2 days by horse," Mason replied. "3 on foot if the weather holds. But nobody's moving in this." "Would people help there?" she asked, her tone threaded with uncertainty she tried to hide. "Depends who you meet," Mason said honestly. "Some would, some wouldn't." She nodded slowly, absorbing another piece of the world she had found herself in. "My people never came near white towns," she said. "They don't trust us." "Plenty don't trust anyone," Mason answered. The tone wasn't dismissive. It was experience. The wind screamed against the roof, making the shutters rattle violently. Taya jumped again before catching herself, frustrated by her own nerves. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, hiding the tremor in her hands. Mason noticed, but didn't say anything. Instead, he crossed the room and lifted a wooden beam, reinforcing the window frame. His movements were methodical, each strike of the hammer controlled. "You reinforce often?" she asked, genuinely curious about how he survived so isolated. "Storms change things," he said simply. "You fix whatever gets weak." She watched him longer than she meant to, studying the quiet patience in each of his actions. There was something different about a man who didn't waste a word unless it mattered. When he finished, he returned to the stool near her bed. The fire crackled behind him, warming his back. She noticed how his legs stiffened when he sat down, and she finally said what she had held back since the night before. "You walk with pain," she murmured. "Your leg." He didn't deny it. "Old injury." "From the ranch fight?" she asked gently. "Yeah," he said, eyes lowering. "Didn't heal right. Winter makes it worse." She absorbed that with a quiet look of understanding. She wasn't the only one carrying scars. Another gust struck the cabin, shaking frost loose from the rafters. Taya's breathing hitched again, but this time she steadied herself faster. The room had grown warmer. Her body had regained some strength. Fear no longer ruled her completely. Mason leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "When you ran," he said carefully, "did you see how many of them were still chasing?" "3," she answered. "One had a rifle. The others had knives." "Did they see you break toward the mountains?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I just ran." She hesitated, then added something she'd left out before, something the listeners would have demanded to know by now. "One of them called my name. That's how I knew they weren't giving up." Mason's expression sharpened. "They knew you specifically?" "Yes," she said, voice tightening. "I cut one of them when they tried to take me. He was still standing when I ran." Mason exhaled slowly, understanding the new danger. That if the storm lifts and they're still looking, they'll circle this ridge. Taya looked down at the blanket, fingers tightening into the wool. "I didn't want to bring danger here." "You didn't," Mason said firmly. "Bad men bring their own trouble. Not you." The conviction in his voice startled her. She lifted her eyes and met his steady gaze. She saw no hesitation, no fear, just a promise he didn't say out loud. He would not let them take her. Outside, the sky cracked with another violent wind burst, but inside the cabin, the growing warmth, the firelight, the steady sound of Mason's voice, and the slow return of strength in Taya's body created something new, a fragile sense of safety forming in a place built for solitude. And as the storm tightened its grip on the mountains, Mason and Taya understood that the danger outside was not finished with either of them. But neither of them will be facing it alone anymore. The storm deepened through the night, pushing new weight onto the cabin roof with slow, heavy thuds that made the wooden beams creak in uneven intervals. Mason woke before dawn, pulled from sleep by the cold brushing along his cheek where the fire had burned low. He rose immediately, added fresh logs, and coaxed the flames back into a strong, steady burn. When he turned toward the bed, he saw Taya lying curled beneath the blanket, her face partly hidden by her hair, her breathing shallow but more regular than the day before. She stirred at the noise of the crackling fire, her eyelids lifting with cautious slowness. The stiffness in her movements made him step closer. "How's your chest?" he asked. His voice held a grounded concern, not a softness, but enough to show he was paying attention. She took a small, controlled breath and winced. "Hurts when I turn," she admitted. "Likely bruised ribs," he said. "Maybe cracked. I'll bind them once the room warms." She nodded and shifted onto her back, revealing the careful way she held herself so her injured side didn't drag. The blanket slipped slightly, and she caught it with her good hand before it exposed the torn bodice again. Her cheeks warmed with slight embarrassment. Mason pretended not to notice, moving instead to fetch a strip of cloth he had torn from an old shirt long before meeting her. Listeners would have wondered if he owned anything clean enough to use for an injury, and the answer came now. He returned to her side with the fabric, and she hesitated before lifting her arm just enough to allow him access. Her eyes stayed on his face, as if waiting for any sign that he would take advantage. She saw nothing but concentration. Mason wrapped the cloth around her ribs, tightening it slowly until she inhaled a little easier. The tension in her shoulders loosened by a fraction. "You're steady-handed," she said, surprised by how gentle he was. "Had to learn," Mason replied. "A man alone fixes all his own injuries." That answer raised another question she hadn't asked earlier: how long he had been truly alone. She studied the rough stitching on his coat, the patched edges of the cabin walls, the organized stack of supplies arranged with no help but his own hands. "How many winters have you stayed here?" she asked. "4," he said without lifting his eyes from the cloth. "Enough to know when a storm means trouble." "And this one," she pressed lightly. "Bad one," he admitted. "Snow's going to bury the door if it keeps up." She swallowed, her gaze drifting to the window where white drifts climbed higher than the sill. "Can you get out if something happens?" "I can dig through when it settles," he answered. "Not moving now. Too deep." That explanation filled a gap listeners would have questioned: why he didn't attempt to ride out for help. It was impossible. They were trapped until the sky cleared. Once the bandage was secured, Mason stepped to the stove and filled a tin with warm broth. When he returned, Taya pushed herself upright using slow, careful movements, determined not to look weak even as her arm trembled from the effort. He handed her the tin and waited silently while she drank. The steam drifting off the liquid softened her expression as the warmth moved through her body. She set the tin down with a shaky exhale. "I don't know why I made it this far," she said quietly. "I ran without looking back. I didn't think." "You thought enough to move toward higher ground," Mason said. "You weren't running blind." Taya's eyes lifted to his. "How did you know I was coming from the ridge?" "The prints angled toward the rise," he answered, and the snow pattern changed near the creek. Someone had passed through fast. A pause settled between them, not tense, simply thoughtful. Taya shifted again, adjusting the blanket to keep the cold from reaching her exposed shoulder. "You said earlier you saw no other tracks," she murmured. "That's right." Her jaw tightened, her expression darkening with the weight of the truth she didn't want to accept. The storm had erased any chance of finding the others. Mason watched her closely, seeing the grief she had tried to keep hidden behind anger and survival instinct. She asked suddenly, "How far is the nearest settlement?" 2 days by horse," Mason replied. 3 on foot if the weather holds. "But nobody's moving in this." "Would people help there?" she asked, her tone threaded with uncertainty she tried to hide. "Depends who you meet," Mason said honestly. "Some would, some wouldn't." She nodded slowly, absorbing another piece of the world she had found herself in. My people never came near white towns, she said. They don't trust us. Plenty don't trust anyone, Mason answered. The tone wasn't dismissive. It was experience. The wind screamed against the roof, making the shutters rattle violently. Taya jumped again before catching herself, frustrated by her own nerves. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, hiding the tremor in her hands. Mason noticed, but didn't say anything. Instead, he crossed the room and lifted a wooden beam, reinforcing the window frame. His movements were methodical, each strike of the hammer controlled. "You reinforce often?" she asked, genuinely curious about how he survived so isolated. "Storms change things," he said simply. "You fix whatever gets weak." She watched him longer than she meant to, studying the quiet patience in each of his actions. There was something different about a man who didn't waste a word unless it mattered. When he finished, he returned to the stool near her bed. The fire crackled behind him, warming his back. She noticed how his legs stiffened when he sat down, and she finally said what she had held back since the night before. "You walk with pain," she murmured. "Your leg." He didn't deny it. "Old injury. From the ranch fight?" she asked gently. "Yeah," he said, eyes lowering. "Didn't heal right. Winter makes it worse." She absorbed that with a quiet look of understanding. She wasn't the only one carrying scars. Another gust struck the cabin, shaking frost loose from the rafters. Taya's breathing hitched again, but this time she steadied herself faster. The room had grown warmer. Her body had regained some strength. Fear no longer ruled her completely. Mason leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "When you ran," he said carefully, "did you see how many of them were still chasing?" "3," she answered. "One had a rifle. The others had knives. Did they see you break toward the mountains?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I just ran." She hesitated, then added something she'd left out before, something the listeners would have demanded to know by now. "One of them called my name. That's how I knew they weren't giving up." Mason's expression sharpened. "They knew you specifically?" "Yes," she said, voice tightening. "I cut one of them when they tried to take me. He was still standing when I ran." Mason exhaled slowly, understanding the new danger. That if the storm lifts and they're still looking, they'll circle this ridge. Taya looked down at the blanket, fingers tightening into the wool. "I didn't want to bring danger here." "You didn't," Mason said firmly. "Bad men bring their own trouble. Not you." The conviction in his voice startled her. She lifted her eyes and met his steady gaze. She saw no hesitation, no fear, just a promise he didn't say out loud. He would not let them take her. Outside, the sky cracked with another violent wind burst, but inside the cabin the growing warmth, the firelight, the steady sound of Mason's voice, and the slow return of strength in Taya's body created something new. A fragile sense of safety forming in a place built for solitude. And as the storm tightened its grip on the mountains, Mason and Taya understood that the danger outside was not finished with either of them. But neither of them would be facing it alone anymore. The wind eased slightly by the next morning, not enough for safety, but enough for the cabin to stop trembling under every blast. Mason woke while the fire still burned low, his instincts pulling him to check the door and windows before anything else. The drifts had climbed past the bottom edge of the window overnight, sealing most of the light outside. He pressed his hand against the cold glass, feeling the depth of the snow beyond it. They were more buried than he expected. Behind him, Taya shifted with a soft groan. Mason turned, watching her brace herself before attempting to sit up. Her ribs made the movement slow and tight. He went to her side immediately. "Easy," he said, adjusting the blanket behind her shoulders. She exhaled through clenched teeth and nodded once. "The pain is sharper today," she admitted. "Means the bruising settled," Mason said. "You'll need more heat on the ribs." He filled a cloth sack with warmed stones from the stove and placed it gently along her side. She inhaled sharply at first, then relaxed as the heat seeped through the cloth. Listeners would have wondered why he hadn't used water. Boiling would have wasted too much fuel, and stones held heat longer. The detail fit naturally. Taya studied him as he worked. "You know how to treat injuries," she said. Had to learn the hard way, he replied without looking up. Ran out of options years ago. She didn't press for more, but the way he talked about the past carried quiet markers she hadn't noticed before. The restraint in his tone, the slight hesitation when memories threatened to surface, the steady determination to keep moving despite them. Mason pulled up the stool again and handed her a larger portion of broth than before. You need strength, he said. Storm's not finished. She blew gently on the liquid and sipped, watching the firelight flicker on the walls. Her gaze drifted toward the cabin's far corner, where a stack of crates sat in neat rows. What's in all those? She asked, wiping her lip with the back of her hand. Tools, spare traps, old maps, some books left by the trapper, Mason replied. He traded me the place before he moved south. Said he didn't want to die in another winter up here. Taya absorbed the information with interest. You knew him well enough to respect him, Mason said. He lived hard, but he kept to himself. Kind of man who didn't ask questions unless he had to. Like you, Taya said quietly. He didn't respond, but she saw a faint shift in his eyes, a recognition that she understood him more than he expected after such a short time. She placed the empty tin on the floor beside the bed. Mason, I need to ask something. Her voice held a seriousness that made him straighten in his seat. Go on. If those men survive the storm and follow the ridge, will they find this cabin? Not unless they know exactly where to look, he answered. This place doesn't sit near any trail. Smoke stays low, and no fresh prints to guide them once the wind covers the ground. Her shoulders relaxed a little, though worry didn't fully leave her eyes. But if they do, I'll deal with it, he said plainly, not as a threat, but as a promise. His tone carried a certainty that gave her something she hadn't felt since the attack. Confidence in someone other than herself. She watched him closely. Why would you put yourself in danger for me? He held her gaze without flinching. Because you were running from the kind of men no one should face alone. The simplicity of that truth reached her deeper than she expected. She looked down at her hands, fingers trembling slightly. My people always told me to rely only on myself, she whispered. Dependence meant weakness. Survival's not weakness, Mason said, his voice low. Knowing when you need help takes more sense than most people have. Her breath caught at the honesty in his tone. She lifted her eyes again, her expression open in a way he hadn't seen before. You speak like someone who's been alone too long. For winters, he answered. Too long, maybe. The wind outside thudded against the wall again, but lighter now, as if the storm's worst had passed. Still, the cold seeped through the edges of the cabin. Mason stood, grabbed his coat, and moved toward the storage shelf. Where are you going? Taya asked, a quick flash of concern crossing her face. Checking the lean-to, he said. Need to see if the horse has enough space to breathe. Snow could block one side. Her eyes widened slightly. You'll go out in this? Won't be long, Mason assured her. The storm's easing. He saw her fear before she spoke it. She didn't want to be left alone in a cabin half buried by cold, wounded, after everything she'd survived. Mason, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, don't stay out too long. He paused by the door, pulling on his gloves. I'll be back before you can worry twice. He stepped outside before she could reply. The wind hit him with sharp force, stinging his face instantly. Snow reached up past his knees. His boots broke through crusted layers with each step, and the cold bit at his lungs. He pushed through the drifts toward the lean-to, where his horse stamped inside the sheltered space, blowing steam into the cold air. The structure held, but one side had begun to bow under the weight of the snow. Mason cleared what he could with fast, efficient movements, tightening a rope line and pulling loose branches before the wall gave out. The effort strained his bad leg, sending a dull spike of pain up his thigh. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to finish before turning back. When he pushed into the cabin again, snow clung to his coat, and his breath came in heavy bursts. Taya sat upright, eyes fixed on the door, gripping the blanket like she expected the worst. You okay? She asked quickly. Lean-to's holding, Mason said, brushing snow from his sleeves. But the drifts are climbing higher. Her eyes narrowed. And you? Cold, he admitted. Nothing more. She watched him rub his leg without thinking, a motion he usually hid. You hurt yourself going out? Just strain an old break, he said. Happens when the cold grabs it. She motioned toward the stool. Sit. Rest before you fall over. Mason almost refused out of habit, but caught the look she gave him. Concern softened by exhaustion. He sat carefully, stretching his leg out to ease the pressure. Taya adjusted the blanket across her lap, studying him carefully. You carry more pain than you let on, she said quietly. Everyone does, he replied. She leaned back against the wall, her eyes not leaving his. Something in her expression shifted, trust settling where fear used to live. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice steady but gentle. When the storm ends, what will you do with me? The question held no accusation. It carried uncertainty, vulnerability, and something deeper she hadn't admitted yet. Mason didn't hesitate. You'll stay here until you're healed, he said. After that, you choose where you want to go. And if I choose nowhere else, she asked softly. Mason's breath tightened, not from shock, but from understanding exactly what she meant. Then I won't ask you to leave, he said. Taya's shoulders loosened. She lowered her gaze, a small, quiet breath slipping from her lips, relief mixed with something warmer. For the first time since the attack, she felt the weight of fear ease enough to let hope slip through. And Mason, watching her settle into the blanket with calmer eyes, realized he didn't mind the idea of the cabin no longer being a place for one. The fire burned bright by mid-afternoon, casting a strong, steady glow across the cabin walls. Taya had drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, her head resting against the stacked blankets while her ribs rose and fell in small, controlled movements. Mason kept one eye on her breathing and the other on the thickening snow outside the window. Each hour added new weight to the landscape, but the wind finally shifted from violent gusts to a steady, calmer push. It meant the storm was nearing its end, but not yet finished. Taya woke with a faint jolt when a piece of settling ice cracked on the roof. Her eyes opened sharp and alert before she remembered where she was. Mason noticed immediately. He walked over, adjusted the warm stone against her ribs, and asked, Pain worse? Not as sharp, she said, rubbing her forehead. Just tired. Her voice showed a weariness deeper than physical injury. Days of running, fear, and loss had carved into her. She looked toward the cabin walls with lingering curiosity. How long have you lived here alone? For winters, Mason replied, placing another log into the stove. Trapline keeps me fed. What keeps me warm? No reason to leave unless supply runs change. She tilted her head slightly. You never thought to go back south? Back to people you knew? He stiffened subtly. The listeners might have wondered this since the beginning, and Taya now pressed the question. Mason took a slow breath. Town I left doesn't want me, and I don't want what's left of that town. What happened there? She asked, her tone careful, not pushing but genuinely wanting to understand. He didn't sit. He stood with one hand resting on the table edge, his shoulders squared. A ranch boss picked a fight that shouldn't have started. Took 3 men with him. One of them was someone I'd known since I was a kid. I tried to stop it. Failed. The confession hung heavy in the warm room. Taya lowered her gaze. You blamed yourself. I still do, he said plainly. Staying alone was the only way I knew to stop making things worse. She studied his face quietly, noting how the small lines between his brows deepened not from anger, but from years of regret worn into habit. But you didn't walk away from me, she whispered. You were in the snow, he said. Anyone would have helped. She shook her head. I don't believe anyone out here would do what you've done. He didn't answer. Instead, he handed her a folded shirt, clean, though worn, which he had found in the storage crate. I stitched the shoulders best I could, he said. Your dress won't hold much longer. Change into this when you're ready. Taya took the shirt with both hands, her fingers brushing the repaired seam. Did the trapper leave this too? No, Mason said. That was mine. Didn't use it anymore. She absorbed that slowly, a quiet gratitude forming behind her eyes. Thank you, she murmured. He moved back toward the window, checking the fog glass for signs of movement. The wind had settled, and flakes fell slower now, drifting lazily instead of slashing across the ridge. The calm after a storm always worried him. Too quiet meant sound traveled farther. Taya watched him, sitting upright with her arms wrapped around the blanket. "Do you think someone could follow my trail once the sky clears?" she asked. Mason thought for a moment. The snow buried everything after yesterday. Anyone looking would have to guess which direction you ran. But if they're determined, she pressed. They'd still need luck, he said. And luck doesn't find cabins hidden under drifts. Her shoulders eased slightly. But she wasn't done. What about smoke? Would someone notice it if they were close? "I burned the lowest cut wood," he replied. "Smoke stays under the tree line. Doesn't rise high." That detail mattered. Anyone listening would have questioned how the cabin avoided detection. Now the answer fit naturally. Taya let the information settle before asking something she hadn't dared before. "Do you think my people, anyone from the ridge, could still be alive?" Mason paused, weighing truth against comfort. He sat down beside her. Not too close, but not distant either. "Some might have gotten farther than you think," he said honestly. "You ran toward the mountains. Others may have gone deeper into the trees." "You believe that?" she asked. "I believe survival surprises people," he said, "even when hope doesn't." She held his eyes a long moment, searching for any sign of empty reassurance. She found none. A soft rumble echoed outside, snow sliding in a heavy sheet from the roof. Taya jumped slightly, but not as violently as before. She closed her eyes and steadied her breath. Mason noticed. "Storm's letting go," he said. "When it stops completely, I'll dig a path to the door." "Will it take long?" 2 hours, he said. "Maybe less." Taya hesitated before asking another question that had clearly nagged her. "Where will you go when you can get out?" He frowned slightly. "Nowhere." "You don't plan to leave?" she asked, surprised. "No," he replied. "Everything I need is here." She drew the blanket tighter around her waist. "And what about me?" "You stay until you decide what life you want," Mason said, staring at the stove flame. "I'm not forcing you out." Her lips parted with a quiet breath. The idea of choosing her future on her own terms was new. She had run because she was hunted, not because she had a destination. She looked at him fully. "What if I don't have anywhere else to go?" Mason's jaw tensed slightly. "Then you can stay longer." Taya studied him carefully before speaking again. "Would that trouble you?" "No," he said. "Not anymore." She held his gaze until warmth spread through her chest. Not from the fire, but from the truth she heard in his voice. Mason stood and checked the crate near the back wall. Inside were the old trapper's maps, folded and tied with leather. Taya watched with curiosity. "What are those?" "Layouts of the ridge," he said. "Trails, water lines, hidden paths. Why do you need them?" "In case things change," Mason answered. "Land can save you or kill you. Depend if you know it." Taya sensed there was something more behind that answer, a habit formed from living alone with danger never far away. "Will you teach me the paths?" she asked softly. Mason paused. "You want to learn them?" "Yes," she said. "If danger comes again. I don't want to be helpless." He nodded slowly. "When your ribs heal, I'll show you." She smiled faintly for the first time since arriving. A small, cautious thing, but real. A moment later, the wind shifted and the snow that clung to the doorway collapsed in a soft, distant slide. The storm had finally passed into a drifting stillness. Taya leaned her head back against the wall, exhaustion settling deeper, but no longer born from fear. For the first time since the attack, she didn't feel hunted. The cabin was quiet. Mason's presence was steady, and the world outside no longer felt like a death sentence waiting beyond the window. "Mason," she said softly. He looked up. "Thank you for giving me a place to breathe." He didn't answer with words. He nodded once and sat beside her on the stool, closer than before, letting the silence between them settle into something warm, quiet, and unmistakably new. The storm had ended, but something far stronger had begun to take shape inside those wooden walls. By the time the storm settled into a silent white blanket across the ridge, the cabin felt warmer than it had since Taya first arrived. The walls no longer shook, and the steady glow of the fire filled every corner with a calm that contrasted sharply with the sharp winds of the days before. Mason pushed himself to his feet and grabbed the shovel he kept near the door, preparing to clear a path outside. But Taya stopped him with a quiet, strained breath. "Before you go," she said, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders, "I need to understand something." He turned back toward her, setting the shovel down. Her posture was stronger now, though her ribs still forced her to sit with care. She held his gaze without the hesitation she once carried. "Why you trust me?" she asked. "A stranger, wounded, running, bringing trouble to your door." The question lingered with weight. Any listener would wonder the same thing. Why a man who avoided people for years would suddenly take a risk like this? Mason walked back to the stool and sat beside her. "I'll watch how you reacted when you woke up," he said. "You were afraid, but not reckless. You didn't reach for a weapon, didn't accuse me, didn't try to bolt. People who mean harm don't behave like that." He paused, his voice lowering. "And someone left in the snow with a torn dress and bruised ribs isn't a threat. They need help." Her eyes softened with something like gratitude, but not fully. "You didn't know what I was running from," she said quietly. "I didn't need to," he replied. Fear tells its own story. She looked down, processing the honesty in his answer. And for a moment she seemed younger, someone who had lost too much and expected nothing good from anyone. He stood again, lifting the shovel. "I'll clear the doorway. Won't be long." This time she didn't ask him to stay. She simply nodded, watching him walk toward the door with controlled, deliberate movements. When he stepped outside, cold air rushed into the cabin for a brief moment before he pulled the door shut behind him. Taya sat in the warm silence, her fingers running along the stitched seam of the shirt he had given her. She had changed into it earlier, managing the task slowly while he repaired the window frame. It was too big for her, hanging loose around the waist and shoulders, but the fabric was soft and clean and held warmth better than her damaged dress. The listeners would have wondered whether she had another set of clothes or belongings. She didn't. Everything she owned had been lost in the attack. That shirt was now the only clothing besides her torn dress. She looked around the cabin again, taking in the small details she hadn't noticed earlier. The careful organization of tools, the 2 crates of dried meat, the maps Mason kept rolled near the back wall, the hunting bow hung above the door. These weren't the belongings of a careless man. Mason lived with intention, with the strict habits of someone who relied on no one. And now he had let her into that life. Outside, snow scraped faintly against the shovel blade. Each sound reassured her that Mason was close, not vanishing into the white wilderness. She tried to shift more comfortably, but her ribs tightened again, forcing a slow, shallow breath. She shut her eyes, pressing her hand carefully over the bandage Mason had wrapped. The warmth she felt from the heated stone placed earlier lingered, easing the ache. Mason returned sooner than she expected. His coat was crusted in snow, his hair damp, and his breath heavy. He leaned the shovel against the wall and stomped the snow from his boots before stepping deeper into the cabin. "Drifts are waist high," he said, clear just enough to open the door fully. "Need daylight to finish the path." "Takes a lot out of you," she said softly. "Cold sharp," he admitted, "but manageable." She watched him shrug off his coat and hang it near the stove to dry. When he finally sat across from her, his expression changed subtly, as if he was debating something. He rested his arms on his knees and looked at her directly. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said, and the room shifted with new tension. "When I cleared the path, I found a set of tracks. Fresh, small." Her breath stopped. "Animal." He shook his head. "Boot prints. Only one set. Light steps. Someone passed close enough to see the cabin roof." Taya felt her heartbeat rise in her throat. "How long ago?" "Hour. Maybe less." The warmth in the cabin seemed to thin at the edges. "Could it be someone from the ridge?" she asked, her voice small, the fear returning without her permission. "Could be," Mason said calmly. But the footprints were careful. Whoever it was didn't come near the door. "Why not?" Her voice trembled. "Someone cautious, maybe scouting, maybe deciding whether to approach." Taya pressed her palm against her chest, steadying her breath. "What if it's one of the men who burned the camp?" "It might not be," Mason said, "but I'm not ignoring the chance." He stood and checked the shotgun he kept near the bed. Listeners might have wondered earlier why he had no rifle visible. Now the reason appeared naturally. It had been hidden under the bed frame, wrapped in cloth to keep the cold from seizing the metal. He loaded it with a measured hand and leaned it within reach. "You don't want to scare me," she whispered. "I want you prepared," he corrected gently. She watched him walk to the window, wipe away the thin layer of frost with his fingertips, and scan the landscape with slow, controlled breaths. His posture stayed still, patient, the stance of a man who had waited out danger before. After a moment, he spoke without turning. "We'll stay inside until the wind changes. If someone's watching, they'll have to reveal themselves when the snow settles." Taya pulled the blanket around her shoulders tightly, her fingers gripping the edge. "I don't want to bring danger here," she said again, the guilt settling deeper now. "You didn't," Mason said, turning toward her. His tone was firm, steady, grounding. "Danger was already in these mountains. You're not the cause of it." She looked at him with wide eyes. "You really believe that?" "I know it," he said simply. He sat beside her again, not touching her, but close enough that the warmth of the stove and the quiet certainty in his presence wrapped around her like a shield. She took a slow breath, then asked the question that had begun pressing on her the moment he mentioned the tracks. "If it is them, what will you do?" Mason didn't blink. "Whatever I have to." His voice held no bravado, no loud promises, just a solid, unwavering truth. Taya's throat tightened. "Mason, I don't want you to get hurt because of me." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady enough to still her shaking fingers. "I've been hurt before. That's not your fault. And I won't let anyone who burned your camp come near you." Her breath caught at the raw honesty in his tone. She reached for his sleeve, letting her fingertips rest there lightly, a quiet thank you that didn't need words. Outside, the sky cleared by inches, revealing patches of pale blue over the white ridge. The storm had ended, but the threat beyond the tree-line had only begun to show itself. And Mason knew whatever waited in the snow would force a choice neither of them could avoid much longer. By the time the sky opened fully and the storm clouds pulled apart into a pale blue stretch across the ridge, the world outside the cabin looked stripped clean, white, silent, and heavy with the kind of stillness that makes every sound sharper. Mason stood by the frost-lined window, watching for any sign of movement along the tree line. His jaw stayed tight, the muscles in his neck pulled into a rigid line that hadn't been there before he found the tracks. Behind him, Taya shifted upright, her breathing steadier than the day before but still careful. She watched him from the bed, studying the tension in his shoulders. "Anything?" she asked. "Not yet," he replied, still focused on the ridge. But the prints weren't blown over. Whoever passed through didn't go far. She swallowed hard. "Could it be one of my people?" "If it were," Mason said, turning slightly, "I think they'd have come to the door." That truth settled unevenly between them. Taya wrapped the blanket tighter around her torso, suddenly aware of how dangerous the quiet had become. Listeners would ask why Mason didn't go out after the tracks, and she must have felt that question forming. "Should you follow them?" she asked softly. Mason shook his head. "Tracks lead into the woods. Too many blind spots. A trap would be easy." She absorbed that, realizing she didn't know how many edges of danger a man like Mason had learned to sense. "You've been hunted before," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. "More than once. And you survive because you don't take risks," she added. "Because I don't take stupid ones," Mason corrected. Taya lowered her eyes, gripping the blanket as if grounding herself. "If someone is watching us, we stay inside. For now," Mason said. "We wait." She nodded, but the worry didn't leave her expression. She glanced toward the stove, then to his leg. "Your injury, does cold make it worse?" "Always," Mason said simply. She bit her lip, guilt creeping into her voice. "I'm keeping you in danger. You're recovering from a beating and a storm," Mason said. "You're not the problem." Before she could respond, he lifted the shotgun from beside the bed and checked the chamber again. The click of metal sent a shiver up her spine, not from fear of him, but from the reminder that someone else might be out there. Mason caught the look and softened his tone. "I'm checking because I don't like surprises. That's all." She nodded, absorbing the reassurance carefully. After a moment, Mason turned from the window. We need food. Broth won't keep you strong much longer. He walked to the shelf and pulled down a sack of dried venison. I'll cook something heavier. Taya watched him slice the meat into small strips, his movements precise, his breathing controlled. She had never seen a man work so silently. Even his footsteps barely registered on the wooden floor. She wondered how long he had trained himself to move like that, quiet enough to avoid trouble, strong enough to face it if it came. She finally asked the question that had weighed on her since the day he found her. Mason, why did you live alone for so long? He didn't look up from the pan. Because silence doesn't lie. She blinked, surprised by the bluntness of the answer. People ask questions that can't be answered, he continued, placing the meat into the sizzling pan. Or they expect things I can't give. Out here, nothing expects anything from me. Until me, Teo whispered. He met her eyes. You didn't ask for anything. She held his gaze, her voice softening. I asked you to stay alive. That's something. His jaw flexed slightly, but he didn't respond. While the meal cooked, Taya pushed herself to stand, bracing her hand against the wall to steady her ribs. Mason turned immediately. Don't, he said. Your ribs aren't ready. I can't stay in that bed forever, she argued softly. I need to move. He walked over and placed one hand near her elbow, not touching her, but close enough that she could lean if she needed. Slow. She lifted her chin. I'll be careful. Her first step was tight and shallow, but she managed it. Mason stayed beside her, matching her pace, tension etched into every line of his posture. She made her way to the table and lowered herself onto the stool with a short breath of relief. He watched her closely. You shouldn't push yourself. I don't want to be helpless, she said. You're not, Mason answered. You survived something most people wouldn't. She exhaled quietly, settling into the stool. Will you teach me what I need to survive out here? She asked, repeating the question from before, but with clearer intent. Mason paused, then nodded once. When you can walk farther than this table. Her lips curled slightly, something not quite a smile but close. He placed the cooked meat in front of her, and she ate slowly, savoring each bite. When she finished, she leaned back, her expression more grounded, more present than earlier. Mason, what if the person who left those tracks comes back tonight? They might, Mason said, but I'll be awake. You'll stay up all night? Wouldn't be the first time. She frowned, her voice tightening with concern. And what about tomorrow? You can't stay awake forever. I don't need forever, he said, just long enough to know what's out there. Taya studied him, something shifting behind her eyes. Let me help. You can barely stand, he said. Help with watching, she clarified. Not with fighting, just watching. She sensed his hesitation before he spoke. You're in pain. You need rest. She leaned forward slightly, ignoring the ache in her ribs. I've lived through things that try to break me. I can keep my eyes open. Mason gave her a long, measured look. Her resolve didn't waver. He finally nodded once. All right, but you rest first. I'll wake you when it's time. Her shoulders eased with relief. She had earned a piece of responsibility back, even if small. As she returned to the bed and lay down carefully, Mason added more logs to the fire. The glow filled the cabin with a golden warmth, but neither of them relaxed fully. The tracks outside were too recent, too precise, too quiet. When Taya closed her eyes, Mason sat on the edge of the table, shotgun resting against his leg, and scanned the frost-blurred trees again. Something in the woods had changed, and when the sun went down behind the frozen ridge, they would find out exactly what. Night settled over the ridge in a deep, unmoving quiet, the kind that made every shift of wind sound like an approach. Mason sat by the window with the shotgun balanced across his knees, the fire dimmed to coals so its glow wouldn't reflect against the glass. Behind him, Taya breathed in a slow, even rhythm, resting after the long day, but not fully asleep. Her eyes opened every so often, checking that he was still there. She finally pushed herself upright, wincing only slightly now. My turn, she whispered. You sure? Mason murmured without turning from the window. I can sit and watch, she said. You've been awake since before sunrise. He didn't move for several seconds, as if deciding whether letting her share the responsibility was worth the risk. When he finally stood, he placed the shotgun on the table and stepped aside so she could sit near the window. Taya settled carefully, adjusting her ribs against the back of the chair. Mason moved to the bed and lowered himself, stretching his legs slowly to ease the ache. Though he leaned back, he didn't close his eyes immediately. "You see anything?" he said. "You wake me, even if it's just a shadow." She nodded, her gaze already scanning the dark line of the woods. "And Taya," he added softly, "don't open that door for any reason." "I won't," she said. Mason let his eyes fall shut, trusting her in a way he hadn't trusted anyone in years. The cabin grew silent except for the wind brushing snow along the outer walls. Minutes passed, then an hour. Taya kept watch, her eyes following every flicker of movement across the moonlit snow. She didn't expect to see anything at first, until something shifted near the tree line. A faint shape, low to the ground. Her breath hitched, and she leaned forward to look closer. A deer stepped into view. Relief washed across her face. She'd forgotten how animals moved after storms, quiet, cautious, following scents they'd lost days earlier. The listeners might have wondered whether the tracks Mason found could have belonged to such a creature, but the prints he described were too straight, too purposeful. This deer moved without pattern, stopping to dig at the snow for buried grass. Taya watched it until it disappeared behind a fallen log. Only then did she release the tension in her shoulders. She turned slightly, checking that Mason was still breathing steady. His face looked softer in sleep, the hard lines along his jaw easing, revealing the exhaustion he'd been carrying since he pulled her from the snow. Another hour passed. Taya's eyes remained sharp, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table for balance. Then she saw movement again. Not an animal this time. A figure stood halfway between the tree line and the ridge, barely visible in the moonlight. Human, broad-shouldered. Still, her breath caught violently. Her fingers froze around the table edge. She leaned closer to the window, steadying her breath so it wouldn't fog the glass. "Mason," she whispered urgently. "Wake up." He was on his feet before she finished his name, shotgun in hand, legs planted firmly despite his injury. He moved beside her with silent precision and followed her gaze toward the ridge. He saw the figure instantly. He didn't speak. He only watched. The man didn't advance. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't shout. He only looked toward the cabin, as if measuring distance. Then he turned and walked into the trees. Taya clutched the blanket around her shoulders, panic rising in her chest. "What does that mean?" "He's scouting," Mason said quietly. "Learning where we are. Learning how close he can get without being seen." Taya shook her head, fear tightening her ribs again. "If he comes back with more." "He won't," Mason interrupted. "He's alone." Taya stared at him. "How can you know that?" Mason's eyes didn't leave the window. Men who hunt in groups move differently. They stay close. They talk. They don't walk that slowly unless they're trying to think through something. She swallowed hard. What is he thinking? Whether he wants to risk coming closer? Mason said. He stepped back from the window and lowered the shotgun slightly. He won't attack tonight. He doesn't know how many people are inside, or where the ground dips under the snow. Taya tried to steady her breathing. What do we do when morning comes? Mason sat beside her, his voice firm but not harsh. We prepare, and we talk to him. Her eyes widened. Talk. Mason, that man. If he meant harm, he'd have waited until the storm ended and rushed the cabin, Mason said, cutting her off gently. He's not sure of us. Taya hesitated, torn between fear and the calm in Mason's reasoning. And if he is one of them, then I'll know, Mason said, and we'll handle it. Taya looked down at her hands, trembling now despite her trying to hide it. Mason saw it and rested his hand lightly over her fingers, not gripping, just grounding her. He won't come in here without going through me, he said. You're safe. She let out a shaky breath, and for the first time since the ridge burned, she believed it without doubt. At dawn, Mason stepped outside while the sky was still pink with early morning light. Taya watched from the window, heart pounding, as he bent to examine the area where the man had stood the night before. He walked a slow circle, studying the individual prints, the direction they pointed, the depth of each step. When he finally returned to the cabin, his expression held something she didn't expect, surprise, but not fear. "What did you find?" she asked, rising from the bed. Mason removed his gloves slowly. "Whoever came wasn't following you." She blinked. "What?" "The prints came from the West Ridge, not the ridge your people were attacked on," Mason explained. "And he didn't approach from your direction. He crossed toward us from the opposite side." Her confusion deepened. "Then why was he here?" Mason set the gloves on the table and looked at her directly. "He was moving toward the trail I used for supplies." "Which means he wasn't looking for you." Taya's breath caught. "Then why watch the cabin?" "Because he saw the smoke," Mason said, "and he wanted to know who lived here." "Who is he?" she asked quietly. "A traveler, maybe a trapper who lost his way, or someone checking the land for game." She exhaled heavily, relief mixing with lingering uncertainty. "He didn't look like a wanderer." "No," Mason admitted, "but he walked like a man who didn't want trouble." That realization settled between them, lifting the fear enough for Taya's shoulders to drop. "So we're safe," she whispered. "For now," Mason said. Then, softer, "and long as you stay here, you'll stay safe." Taya stepped closer, her ribs protesting only faintly. "Mason, I don't want to choose anywhere else." He held her gaze, eyes steady, voice low. "Then stay." She reached up and touched his jaw lightly, the gesture trembling but full of quiet certainty. Mason didn't pull away. He closed the distance with slow, deliberate movement, his forehead touching hers first, as if making sure she wanted the closeness. She did. Their kiss was slow, warm, careful, the kind that carried more relief than passion, more trust than urgency. Her hand slid to his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her gently against his chest. When they finally parted, Taya didn't step back. She whispered, almost breathless, "I choose you." Mason's hand stayed on her waist, grounding them both. "And I choose you." They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin walls, clearing the remaining snow, and preparing the lean-to. Taya moved cautiously but stronger than before, her ribs healing enough to let her work without collapsing. Mason taught her how to stack wood to block wind, how to tie knots that wouldn't freeze, how to read shallow prints before the sun erased them. Nothing hunted them. Nothing stalked the ridge. The man never returned. And as evening settled in, Taya curled beside Mason under the thick blankets, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm